So we'll start the webinar with an introduction by Marat, who is the Senior Program Manager at Portuguese. And following this, Athena, Pradeep, and I will be presenting our journey of measuring social movements. So without wasting any time, I'd request Marat to please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tarini. Nice to meet you all. Welcome to this webinar on measuring collectivizations. My name is Marit. I'm from Portuguese. We are a philanthropic organization which seeks to address different kinds of social and environmental issues by collaborating with partners, local partners and global partners. And many of them are collectives led by people with lived experiences. For example, refugee-led organizations, or network formed and led by the indigenous communities. Well, I think we have more than 100 people in this room today, and we work on many different issues, but I bet we have two common interests which bind us together. One is, I'm sure like all of you are very passionate about social change, about environmental change, and also recognize the contributions of collectives, those led by the constituents in the system at all levels, from hyperlocal to macros. You may be one of them, you may be supporting them, you may be an ally to them, you may be evaluating them, or maybe you heard of them and want to know more. We all have an interest in collectives. Secondly, we're all also very interested in how change happens within the collectives and beyond the collectives. But we may be curious about that. We may be amazed by how collectives are pushing boundaries. We may be frustrated about how to measure that. Today, the sessions, I'm sure that's the tools and approach introduced by folks at Praxis will either reaffirm your positions, your views, or challenge you, provoke you to think differently. But either way, I think it will be a good debate, which I look forward to. Before I pass it over to Praxis, I'd like to share with you three reflections I have. I have the opportunity to engage with this process, the tools development, piloting, trying out with some of the movements. And for me, the first reflection is the measurement of how to measure this are very connected to who are they, who are the collectives, how do they function. And what struck me in the approach of Praxis is that collectives are living organisms. They are like human bodies. They eat, they sleep, they work, they may like each other, they may not like each other. It's a living organisms. And in a sense, measuring collectives is like measuring life itself. But it is not a daunting or insurmountable task to evaluate or measure life, then we shouldn't be too frustrated about not getting everything right in measuring collectives. Certainly, it's not a denial of the essence and contributions of the collectives. It's actually a space for us to learn and unlearn and reflect and innovate to sharpen our senses and our methods and understand collectives and the contributions better. My second reflection comes from my recent conversations with a colleague, Dennis, and he was using ChatGPT. I think this day we either admit that we're using it or we just deny that we're actually using it. So he was using ChatGPT to see how do we measure, what are the indicators that we can use to measure movement or collectives. Very interestingly, you can also try it. The list of indicators that ChatGPT or AI comes up with are very impressive, I would say. For example, measuring the ideology coherence, measuring the internal well-being, etc. That comes to my second thought of who are doing this measurement and for whom. Is it coming from the movement themselves, coming from the collective themselves, or coming from external? Are we generating evidence or learning for the collectives, or this is to provide a report, to turn a report to a funder? And so I think it is worth thinking about the positionalities of the measurers and the relatives and the collectives and the relative powers in this ecosystem. My third reflections and the final one is today we're together to talk about measurements of collectivizations. To flip it around, then what could be the imaginations of a community or collective of measurers. That we are all this speak directed to you as a participant, as a stakeholders, that we come together to learn and unlearn. Would there be a space? What would be a space look like for us to continue this learning journey so that we can again improve the methods, like create space to nourish the collectives and also to advance social justice together with them. So I will part you with this thought, and with that, I will leave it to Tarini and other colleagues at Praxis to take it forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marat. And I completely agree about ChatGPT. It's sometimes amazing with the indicators. But yeah, and thank you for that. We'll now start with Athena, who will set the context of our journey. And following this, I'll dive into the why of why we thought there was this need to really rethink traditional measurement approaches and what makes social movements so unique and sets them apart. And finally, we'll have Pradeep, who will take us through the how of what we're thinking about this self-reflective tool and what we're really thinking are ways to really try and measure social movements. So I'd like to hand over now to Athena, who will take us through the context. Thank you.
Thank you, Thalini. Hi, everyone. So I'll be taking you all through the context. So we embarked on a journey of evolving a self-reflective tool for collectives that access grants. We realized that not all collectives call themselves social movements, as many collectives are still in their formative stages. So when we look at social movement, here we look at social movement not as a structural formation, but more as an approach. So any organization that follows collectivization, localization, and the commitment of leaving no one behind may find resonance with the social movement approach. So there has been a growing recognition that sustainable change, especially systemic shift and structural change, is possible through community-led collective bargaining processes. And this recognition has now percolated among grant makers, and there is now this growing interaction between funders and collectives. In one of our interactions with community-led organizations and campaigns, we discussed some of the key challenges that they face in their interaction with grant makers. And when we asked them what are some of the questions that grant makers ask, these were some of the challenging questions that were presented by the collectives to us. So once these questions were listed down by the collectives, we then clubbed it to kind of 3 main sections and found that most of the questions that the grant makers were asking the collectives had to do with questions regarding diversity and inclusion, membership and engagement, as well as financial management and sustainability. So it was not that collectives were not aware of these questions, but however, often there is a challenge of articulation. And most often there is little time that collectives have to reflect on these questions in a sustained way. So the fear that we had when we heard the voices of these collectives was that while grant makers appreciate the process of collectivization, their systems continue to look at collectives the way they look at civil society organizations. And also they use the same measurement tools for collectives that they do so with CSOs and NGOs. Thus, we felt this need to develop a self-reflective assessment tool along with these collectives to not only reflect on key significant issues, but also help them engage with grant makers with better articulation of their journey. And this journey is detailed out in Sindhanai 1, which was published last year in the month of October. So this process or our journey started with meeting with 7 collectives and followed by a review of our experience and work with a number of movements and grant makers. From these discussions, we evolved 5 papers and engaged with experts. We then deep dived with one collective, which is the Sanitation Workers Collective, and evolved a self-assessment tool. We realized that our process with that collective was not straightforward, and it was not just asking them the indicators that they would like to assess themselves on. Rather, we traveled with different members of the collective in a journey of self-reflection on a number of themes relevant to their journey and the challenges. After these discussions and reflections, we asked them for indicators to measure the change, and they evolved very informed indicators. We then took these indicators and our process to movements in Southeast Asia, and in a meeting with 3 social movements working on migration in Bangkok, we explored whether these indicators and journey resonate with them. From this emerged the various complexities of measuring a social movement. We then reviewed a couple of toolkits that exist that look at how to measure social movements and understood that there has been a significant progress in the measurement ecosystem. Going ahead, we would like to leverage those experiences and try to build upon it. So now we would like to start with understanding the complexities of measuring social movements, and I request Tarni to take it forward from here. Thank you.
Thanks, Athena. So often social movements and collectives that we talk about are often the ones that don't really showcase the work that they do, or they don't seek recognition for the work done. The wins and losses that are there are often deeply personal. It's not tied to the success or failure of a project. And a lot of the work done by movements or collectives is often invisible and intangible. And it's often only when there's a shift in the narrative to even external people realize that the strength of that movement. So imagine trying to measure something that doesn't really want to be measured. And however, what we realize is that if they don't measure themselves, they also run the risk of being judged by the standards of others. This is where we feel our self-reflective tool comes in. It's not a tool for evaluators or grant makers to really judge whether the movement is good or not. Instead, it's for the movement to reflect on whether their strategies align with their own philosophies. So that's the essence behind what we were trying through the self-reflective tool. And I think before we embarked into that self-reflective tool, we'd like to spend a little time on understanding the complexities of social movement. So what is it that makes collectives unique and different from any other entity? So we point these out specifically in the context of measurement, also highlighting some of the challenges that measurers themselves go through often in these contexts. And here, when we refer to measurers, we're referring to anyone who might be interested in understanding the movement better. This could be someone internal or external. So while there are a number of complexities that we could have gone into, we've for now restricted ourselves to 6 complexities that we saw that were common across the diverse movements that we spoke. And these are the 6 that I'd like to present today. So the first complexity that we identified was that of architecture. The way movements organize themselves are often very different from any other organization. We thought one way we could maybe represent this was through a complex structure such as a wave. The dynamic architecture highlights the fluid and evolving nature of social movements, where their true structure lies in the patterns of collective energy and action. So these movements, just like waves, could at some times be loosely organized networks, or could at times, when required, become defined structures. And what is the key is that this architecture could exist at certain times and then just break back into a loose network, similar to how a wave often breaks back into the ocean. And with this, we recognize that the journey that a wave goes through could be of many kinds. It could be that the wave goes in and out of a loose structure. They could take the form of a defined structure. There could be multiple factions that break out of this structure, all stemming from that one wave. Or it could be one that goes through different stages at different times, points of time. So this fluidity and lack of a defined architecture at all times often makes it difficult for measurers to actually measure this movement that is happening. So leading from this came the second complexity, that often when measurers come to measure a social movement, and especially if it's an external evaluator, they're usually unable to capture only the whole movement. They're only able to capture a snapshot and maybe capture the terms, and they're unable to capture the different turns and the different waves of the journey through the movement has taken. For instance, imagine a boat going through a river. If a photographer captures only one image of the boat, They miss the entirety of the journey, where it started, what were the different obstacles that it navigated, and maybe the destination that it aims to reach. Similarly, a social movement's journey is often very dynamic and ongoing, and evaluating it based on a single snapshot often overlooks that broader context and the evolution of that movement. And this is also an analogy that we used is one of a videographer or photographer keeping track of a race. You might need to run along with the race in order to capture that in a photograph or more likely in a video. The third complexity lies in recognizing the social movement often function as an invisible whole, much like a school of fish. So each fish has its own perspective and a unique way of moving, but together they appear as a unified group. Similarly, in social movements, individual members may have their own views, their own roles, but collectively they can be seen as one entity. So this presents a significant challenge, especially for evaluators. Who do you speak to within the movement? The movement's strength lies in its collective nature, making it difficult for evaluators to pinpoint a single representative. Speaking to one person may not capture the diverse perspectives and the unified direction of the entire movement. So the complexity highlights the difficulty in measuring the true essence of a movement by focusing only on a few individual voices within that collective whole. The fourth complexity that we have is again linked to measurers and evaluators, that often evaluators come with pre-existing frameworks, those that they might have used with NGOs or with different corporate entities. But we find that when applied to social movements, we need to recognize that if you use the same net, while you might catch some tangible elements which can be measured, you may miss out on a lot of intangible essence that might define the movement. So for instance, you might catch a few big fish, but you might miss out on the millions of diverse small fish that are in the sea. So you might catch things that are very tangible, but miss those that can't be really caught. The fifth complexity refers to origin points. Just a minute. So the idea of origin is often important for measurers because they look for ways to scale up or ways to replicate a similar model elsewhere. So we need to recognize that for a movement to come together, there are often numerous factors at play. So for instance, you have the mainstream social sector, you have development aid, you have different economic perspectives at that time that all trigger the social movements. So this makes it difficult to really track and trace the exact origin point of the movement. And therefore, for a measurer to also drill down on the origin becomes difficult. Similar to how a wave and figuring out where that wave began becomes very tough. Finally, we move to the last point of non-linearity, which is something if someone has seen Sindhanai 1, which is the first book that we had come out with, we explain in that as well. And was really the first complexity that we saw in the movements that we spoke to. Yeah, no, I can take this. So much like the ebb and flow of waves, capturing the dynamic and fluctuating nature of movements is complex, especially when you come with traditional measurement frameworks. You could often miss out on the different weather systems that are influencing that wave. So for instance, there could be wind, there could be rocks, there could be rain that the wave is dealing with. But if you're only focused on the water, you might miss these contextual influences. I might request Pradeep to now give the example of Tamil Nadu.
Yeah, I think, yeah, next slide. Yeah. The subsequent slide. Yeah, next slide. Yeah, in Tamil Nadu, with one of the collectives working with sanitation workers, the collectives of the sanitation workers, what we realized was while trying to map the journey of engagement, we borrowed the famous Ambedkar principles of educate, agitate, and organize. Primarily, most of the activities which a movement was doing was largely about, you can actually put them into these three categories of educate, agitate, and organize. And in an example where they were mobilizing their sanitation workers, one of the instances which was pointed out was when they started engaging, they started creating some kind of pressure on the mainstream when they said that to the local panchayat that we are not going to further go for sanitation work unless you are ready to pay us the wage. So therefore, what happened was while the stage of educating, agitating, organizing was happening, that it was still okay. But when they moved into the stage 3, where it started putting certain demands in the mainstream, there the mainstream started panicking, and mainstream then started its own journey of educate, agitate, and organize. Whereas for a social movement, it has to create its own actions through educate, agitate, and organize, whereas the mainstream had its own systems already in place in the form of schools, in the form of police, in the form of systems which are existing. They use the mainstream system itself to educate, agitate, and organize. So the stage 3 is the stage where they start some kind of a retaliation, and with stage 3 start beginning of retaliation, and in stage 4 it starts its retaliating. And what it did in this scenario, in this example, was where around 14 sanitation workers were protesting. They gave the contract to 4 of them. So now 4 of them went to work, and now the entire protest started fizzling out. So in a way, what started happening was that mainstream knows how to engage with it. And as the mainstream started engaging, you will see that entire protest started fizzled out. That is the stage 5. And it all depends on at what stage, grant maker goes there or an external person goes there. So it's not that the social movement withdrew was not something. It is a failure. It is a beginning of the next journey of it. So in that way, the next slide. So what we saw was it is a spiraling of the movement collectives, which in one agenda it was taking into the section stage 5, whereas in another agenda it has started with from the stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. So therefore, we found that but at the same time, to present the stages in a kind of a non-linear way we found very impossible to present it, because even this journey, stage 1, stage 2, it looks like a very linear journey. So therefore, we realize that often in our evaluators, they are in a binary. Either you have to be linear or you have to be non-linear. But this is the video where we saw, there are 24 linear things which are happening in the movement. And each of them are linear, but at the same time, it is really not it's really, so therefore you should not dismiss the linearity. You should measure the linearity, but at the same time, do not think that the movement is moving in a linear line, because movement could be multilinear with many directions. Therefore, it was important to not to dismiss linearity as well, while clearly saying that it is a non-linear movement. Yeah. So what we tried to do, you want to go ahead? What we tried to do was that these collectives, we give these 6 complexities which we tried to identify from various things to the collective, and then we ask them. It's more like triggering them to understand that whether these complexities are applicable to your movement, but if they may not be, all of them may not be applicable, and then we ask them for more complexities which they feel are there in measuring some of the intangible things. And then we ask them what are the solutions which they have in terms of measuring this journey. So in a way, we are not saying these are the only 6 complexities which are there, nor we are saying these are the things applicable. But idea here is to create a Sindhanai, to trigger them to think of complexity in the measurement. Yeah. Next slide. So while these complexities were there, we were also trying to find out, okay, these are the complexities. Now we have to find some ways to address some of these complexities. to reimagine your system, measuring system. So in a way, we saw that, okay, collectives can be seen from two lenses. One is the intrinsic lens, which is on the left side, where how the social movements itself is shaping up in their journey. Whereas on the right side, it is about how the social movements gives social movements or any collective gives an ideological response to an external things which are happening. So we tried to measure both part of it, because often certain grant makers or evaluators are more interested in instrumental value of the social movements or collectives, whereas many of them are also interested in how the collectives are shaping up. So therefore, we thought of doing it in a sense, we are looking at both the things. If we start with the external part of it, the first one is as we say in any power relationship, both context and power matters in assessing the collectives. So the first thing was the context. With respect to the context, we used our famous participatory tool, which is one of the tool which we call it as River of Life tool, where we ask the collectives to understand the journey from the time they feel it is the beginning of that movement and to as of now, and to mark those milestones. And this we did with within social movements with different locations of people. We did this, and some of them mapped the journey of the movement, some of them mapped the journey of the issue which they are representing. So in a way, it is important to map both the movement and how the issues are shaping up. So, and the second context is, of course, the contemporary context of what is happening, which also we have a number of participatory tools, including social mapping, resource mapping, etc., to map it. So in that way, both the historical and contemporary context matters. In one of the sessions where we met the collectives, social movements who are working on the migration issues to come together, and they mapped the journey from 1970s onwards to 24, and they found that how over the years, in the beginning, where there was a resistance against neoliberal agenda, and how that has been in the next subsequent 50 years, you saw them actually getting institutionalized in the Global South governments as well. So when they did the both historical context, what came out is if you see this kind of a map where you see at the top, you see that the neoliberal agenda getting powerful, the mainstreaming was happening. Earlier, it was only within few global North governments, but then by now, you will see that most of the global South governments have adjusted and reconciled with the mainstream. So whereas in 1970s, the global South governments were part of the social movements in the global South, whereas by 2024, even the social movements started weakening. So this historical context was something very important for the migration movements to understand how the landscape of social movements have changed over the period of 50 years. Yeah, the next slide. Now they reflected on how this is literally shaping up in the current context, and the collectives realized that one, there is a very powerful neoliberal agenda which is encouraging free trade and free investment, whereas at the same time there is also a powerful nationalism, or I would say rather borderism, which is protecting their own citizenry. So you have a current context where people are looking for free trade and free investment, but completely controlled movement of labor. While this is something which is existing, there is also the aging demography in the global North, which requires young bodies. And there is also cheap and unorganized labor, which is existing in the global South. And similarly, there is also global South is fighting with each other in terms of becoming the manufacturing base. So this is the context which they evolved during this mapping and all, which was important for them to understand that how they want to provide an ideological response to this context. Yeah, next slide. Yeah, in a way, when they looked at it, it is important for them to take support from the grant makers at various stages, and And in a stage, they what are the support, what are the actions they took when they mapped those actions? Some of them were in the form of strategy, and some of them were in the form of what they called as tactics. So in a way, to make a point that in certain times they use certain tactics, which is literally to some extent is a compromise on their philosophy, but they had to do it to survive, to be in the process. So this is something, again, another reflection they did to understand their actions and decisions which they have made, and to reflect on that. And their fear has always been that what they started as tactic later became strategy for the subsequent generation of the movement builders into it. So that is something which they had reflected on. Yeah, the next slide. Now, that was the context part of it, how it evolves into the discussions in social movement. The second most important thing was on the root cause. So here, we use our very popular problem tree and solution tree, which is in terms of problem tree, we put the middle stem as something if it is a migration issue, is the migration movement challenges is the stem. Then whatever is the one on the leaves or something which is the manifestation of the problem, how they exist, which are largely the symptoms which we call, and the branches are the related problems. Whereas there are within roots, there are visible roots, which we call it as trigger causes, and the deep-rooted causes. So in a way, you can actually map all the causes within the problem tree, and the movement and the collectives then look at, okay, these are the movements, these are the things, and they find the solution tree also. What are the things they do to address these things? And then if you see in the addressing part of it, some of them are addressing symptoms. Some of them, like, for example, helping migrants with food or any kind of issues they are facing in terms of health, etc. Whereas some of them are to the nature of systemic shift, and some are to take on the structural issues. So then we ask the questions here that are the identified solutions addressing the symptoms or the deep root? Where is the balance with respect to the collectives? Where are they focusing more? Are they on symptoms? Are they on root cause? Are they on trigger causes? So this gives them a reflection on how they actually how they look at their own actions, and also what are the systemic shift, etc. Now the next slide. Next, we thought is about the power, like in that way, where because the movement or the collective exists in a web of power relationship. Here also we use a very popular Venn diagram, which we say in participatory methods and tools, where we literally ask them to locate themselves in the center and then identify various stakeholders, and the size of the shape and size varies according to the indicators which they feel with respect to power relationship. In a way, they locate themselves under various kinds of power relationship. And this again varies to whom you are asking within the social movement or collectives. Yeah, next slide. So this three helps them to understand how the collective is ideologically responding to the external thing. But definitely, from the root cause, when they understand whether they are addressing the symptoms or they're understanding the systems and structures, often the collectivization process is generally encouraged to make system shift or structural change. And it is often very difficult to help people understand what is system and what is system and structure. Here we try to use a chess as an analogy, where you have a mainstream with a white coin and a social movement or a collective with a black coin. And each of the coins are some kind of an institutions. And these coins are like ministries or religion. Each has their own rules. They have their own way of how the third one is the rules, which is that a horse will go in straight and a left or right turn, or the camel or king can move only one side. So each of the institution has its own rules, and some of the collectives build in in capacitating the structure, and some of them are more keen on changing the rules. But then there is also the board. Board is the what we call it as a structure, and how it is the coins are sticking on the structure, and this and in fact, if the structure is removed, it is like a structure here. We call it as in a negative sense, it could be patriarchy, it could be caste system, it could be racism, or etc. But sometimes if we look at it from a positive sense, it could be constitution, Indian constitution, or any constitution which becomes the basic structure. Based on that, everything should move. So idea here is to help the collectives understand about how to understand what is engaging with individuals, engaging with system, engaging with rules, and engaging with structure. Then for each one of them, they coin the various kinds of activities. So again, it's an analogy to help understand and categorize different activities which a collective is doing or planning to do. The next slide. Then we moved into the internal part. Internal part was much more challenging because often to reflect on activities, it is often easier because they will easily list out all their activities, all their problem, but to reflect on how they internally are shaping up. And one of the parameter which we thought is interesting and important for everyone was on the collective leadership. Again, on collective leadership, our aim, we borrowed from the analogy of the wave, analogy of the, what is the visible part of it. In a way, you will see a lot of any funder or a grant maker or a measurer, when they look at the collective, they immediately want to know who should I speak to, who is the person whom I can, what is the leadership in it. And immediately their imagination of a leadership is just like an NGO. You reach out to a CEO, you reach out to somebody, the board, or you reach out to someone at the level of senior management, and then you go middle management, etc. So this kind of seeking of particular structure itself is a problem in measurement, because then you get into that dependency of it. So therefore, one of the way we thought we bring an analogy here is, I think many of you might have seen the flock of birds which fly, and they fly in a way that there is a one bird, and then there are 2-3 birds, then increased number of birds, and it takes a shape of a kind of a triangular shape of sometimes it is bird, it is flock of 10 birds, sometimes it could be even flock of 400 or 500 birds. But what is interesting about it is that if we ask collective to imagine it like this flock, and then you will see the bird in the front, when it gets tired, it goes back, and some other bird takes the turn to lead on it and gives its energy to the thing. So in a way, during the journey, you will see a number of birds taking turn to take the leadership of that journey. And they are also, as part of the groups, within certain groups, within that bigger flock also, they have their own groups of birds which take the turn. So we tried to help them understand that if we imagine the collective leadership in this way, where many people take turn at various point of time when a particular kind of energy is needed, is it something which helps? Then one of the group actually started finding out how different people within the collective had taken leadership at different point of time and what happened to them. So again, this is a way by which we just help trigger this concept of collective leadership within that group, and then they started coming out with various indicators for assessing their own, reflecting on their own collective leadership. Yeah, the next slide. The next one is, of course, about the projectization, which is what the migrant movement in Southeast Asia, they pointed out how they resonated with the projectization. A very clear social movement from until 90s and early 2000, how it was completely NGOized at various point of time in early 2000, and now many of the movements are reinitiating them with the same approach which was there in 90s. So in a way, they showed their journey, and some of the things which we thought was important to do, it was through a tool which we evolved with sanitation workers in India, was on the fund angiogram. here we wanted to say that, okay, if you put some fund within the collective, the fund takes many avatars. Some of the avatar is in the form of people, it could be in the form of skills, it could be in the form of assets, it could be in the form of certain activities. And then use something like angiogram and find out where is the blockade, where you feel that the fund will literally the activity will get blocked if the fund disappears. What will happen to them? And then they reflect on these activities, these people. And interesting thing in this is that sometimes the fund, if it gets into a collective in a form of a project, and that project has an incentive for even the community members in the form of some amount, then even there is a binaries that starts getting created within the collective also. Some of them who have some incentive from the project, while others are not. And you will see that many the next slide, many new people become very powerful in this collective. Some of them funder itself could become, and sometimes the network of other partners of funders, or sometimes the intermediaries become powerful, and sometimes within the collective, somebody who knows the language of the funder becomes powerful. So in a way, the collective sees a lot of shift within its own architecture. Yeah. The next slide. Right, this is where the mapping is. So you will see a funder becoming powerful, introducer, funders, partners, then members who have some salaries or honorarium. So you can actually see a participatory mapping of power holders whose power has changed since the funding has started. And this funding, interestingly, need not be an external funding also. It could be in the form of an internally resourced funding. Therefore, there is a big challenge to understand what is the problem here. Is it the problem of a grant making concept, or is it a money itself, or it is the decision making process around money? What itself is a problem here is something which we were trying to understand. But there, it is important to have this as an exit strategy, but now what we call it is actually the exit strategy, so that even if the fund exits, the collective exists. So therefore, and the idea here is to map what has changed since the funding has come into the collective, like whether it has been shifted from a people-owned collective to a collective serving people, or from demanding for representative administration, has it started claiming rights from a non-representative administration? So in a way, there is a change in philosophy. Has it percolated in the collective? So this was a good thing which we did with one of the movement. But idea here is not to say that this should not happen or this should happen. Idea here is to help them reflect whether this is happening, and are they happy with that, or are they comfortable with that, or are they not comfortable with that? Yeah. The next slide. And the last one was, I think, probably the most challenging one, where we often challenge the collectives, and collectives often challenge themselves, which is on the intersectionality. And here we wanted to reflect on what could be the way by which it can be explained or something. And if you see this kind of this picture, so like those who are feminist movements, they work. They try to get liberated from their patriarchal system, and they come out of patriarchy. Similarly, trade unions, they try to engage with capitalism and try to come out of the capitalism. Anti-caste movement and anti-racism movement comes out of casteism. Similarly, about ableism. So each one has a social identity focused approach, and they try to liberate from the notorious isms they are engaging with. But then we ask them the subsequent question in the next slide is about the fact that in their decisions, were they neutral to some of the other isms which they are fighting? For example, those who are engaging patriarchy, did they leverage caste system to push out of patriarchy? Or feminism? Did they or caste? Did they leverage capitalism to come out of caste issues? So in a way, therefore, we try to, if we go back to the previous slide, so each one probably, if they are leveraging other isms to come out of, get liberated from their respective isms, you will finally, in the end, you might see the same wall, which is, so the problems is each of these notorious isms often build nexus with other isms and then try to rebuild itself. So this was the kind of an analogy which we evolved through, few of the collectives, and then we use them to do it. And here we not only reflect on the isms only, but here representation also matters. So we try to find out whether all the isms are, all those people who are against these isms are also getting represented in the collective leadership. So this is how we have shaped these 6 indicators. Yeah, the next slide. I know we are taking a lot of time. I'll just finish it in another 3 slides. So at the end, for us, it is there are also diverse kinds of collectives. Some of the collectives are huge in numbers. Some of the collectives were earlier huge in number. Now they do not. And some of them are a small group of 4 or 5 people, but they were able to make a lot of change in the narrative. So therefore, often we try to find out how to measure a success of those things. It is those both internal and external. Is it? I think somewhere we are trying to ask the collective: is it about the percolation of ideological thoughts in the daily lives and discussions of the members? An appreciative fear of a particular philosophy even among the mainstream. So, for example, today you may not have women's representation in some of the corporate boards or anything, but definitely they fear the question might be asked to them, that where are the women in the group, or where are the women in the panel? All these questions are something which are an outcome of many years of the feminist movement. So it is the same percolation of philosophy or ideology is something which needs to be measured to really understand the significance of some of the number of the collectivization exercise experiments which are taking place. Yeah, the next slide. So therefore, I think some of the questions which we generally leave away with in our reflective tool is that, are there spaces of accountability being created or reviewed and promoted? And are new leaders, when the new leaders emerge, are they aware of this philosophy, etc.? So these are some of the reflective tools. And the last one is the next slide. I think I'll stop here with the positionality of the measurer. It is important. I think one of the slides which Tarini showed was often the measurer has to travel as fast as as an athlete to actually get a glimpse of a very good photographer, good view of the thing. While the space is not something which we are here, but here it's an analogy is about the philosophy. If the positionality of the measurer is very different from the social movement, will they be able to appreciate the social movements, the movement or social part of the movement? So in a way, the positionality of measurer is important. And we are not saying that it is about internal or external. It is more about, I would say, about the positionality. And sometimes within the social movements also, you may not necessarily have everyone with a complete alignment with the philosophy of what the movement represents. So they are all in a kind of a journey. So therefore, some of the positionality issues are important. And it could be external, could be internal. But ideally, what is more important is the ideology or philosophy of the movement, of the measurer. And yeah, I'll stop here and I'll hand over to Tarini from Athena. Sorry.
Thank you, Pradeep. So before we proceed, we would just like to share a small feedback form. It'll be put up on chat. So we would really appreciate it if everybody present here could actually give in their feedback and just fill in the form. In the meantime, we would like to make a small announcement. So Praxis Institute for Participatory Practices is organizing the 26th edition of the workshop, and the module for this year would be participatory methods and approaches. But within this, we are offering an elective on measuring collectivization. So if anyone's interested in it, they can check out or register. So the details will be put up on chat. So I believe now we can move to the Q&A session. So yes, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to put it up on chat or unmute and ask the question.
Yeah, I think if anyone has comments or reflections on this as well, you could raise your hands and then we could unmute you. I know there's already one question in the chat, but yeah, we could start with you, Renuka. I'm just gonna take you one.
Hi, Tarini, Athena and Pradeep. Thank you. It was a very good presentation. I think we're all, as an independent evaluator, one has, been asked to measure collectivization, and it's always been a challenge to try and capture everything. But I think it's very interesting that you're not looking only at the end point. My question is that the collectives that you were looking at were 7, which I think were Karnataka based, and then there were others which were more Asia based. So was there a difference in the more local collectives vis-a-vis the more state, national, or regional collectives? Was the methodology that you were using different, or in terms of also the growth of the collectives, the different stages of growth, some which are older, some newer, and also based on the thematic? Did you look at all that as well? Thank you.
Thank you, Renuka. Maybe we can take one more and then answer these together. Sarah, if you wanna.
Thank you. Thank you, Praxis, for a very interesting presentation. I'm from a funding organization, the Freedom Fund, and I guess I was quite interested in the whole presentation. Thank you for that, but also specifically on the parts about how funding influences the power dynamics of the collective. And I'm wondering if you could go into a bit more detail about how collectives grappled with that. Did some collectives just outright say no to funding, or find it quite it was too much influence over their direction? Did others appreciate funding but only for specific areas? If you had any further insights, that would be quite helpful.
Yeah, I think to both the questions, it's one, we did not go deep dive into each of these collectives. It was more for us as more like a respondent here. So we are not trying to find out the exact methodology of how to measure collectivization. But here, what we are trying to do is more to find out what are the challenges, what are the complexities involved. So while we were saying that we know that there's a huge difference among different collectives, because when we try to say that context matters, when we try to say location matters, when we try to say power relationship matters, so therefore each of these things is going to influence how you are going to measure them. But at the same time, what we try to find out is what is the overall principles which we can keep in mind while measuring collectivization. Therefore, we did not go deeper into different contexts, but we tried to say that, okay, context matters. How do you want to incorporate in your methodology, in your assessment framework, or in your actions? It could be action research. So in that way, we tried not necessary to make a difference. It's more like an advocacy thing for us to influence this evaluation ecosystem that not to go with a kind of a methodology which has been evolved in a non-collectivization framework into a collectivization. I think wanted to send that message. With respect to Sarah also, I think it is not to say that the grant makers should fund or not fund, or when they fund, how they want to take care of the funding systems, how it is going to influence the collectives, etc. It has been too early for us to make any comments on that. But what we did understand is that that a projectized way of or instrumental way of using collectivization for a program has as much of a challenge as you do with, as anybody does with any other framework. So the idea here is that what is important is for collectives to form an exit strategy before embarking into a program. So this is a way by which we try to help them. And in one of the exercise, we did try to find out, because when the fund enters, who are the people who were not powerful are becoming more powerful. So in a way, that is more important. So sometimes the funders will say that, you know, some of our partners would like to visit, or funders will say, why don't you use this intermediary? Or intermediary might say, why don't you bring this capacity building partner? So you will have a lot of way by which the power power influence takes place. And those are the ways by which the mainstream ideology tries to enter the philosophy of the social movement. So the social movement or collectives have to be very wary of these things. That's all. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think one bit on the grant making side that I'd also just like to add is that's also one side of this conversation which we're also building our work on. We have had a few conversations with a few grant makers, and it's also something interesting to note that often we think of the funds as the problem, but I think it's more the mindset behind the funds which is what's more important. So it's not exactly per se the funds. We often, I think, give too much importance to that, but it's with what intent are you giving that fund, which becomes important. If you're taking the journey along with collective, if their losses also become your losses, then it's not the fund that is changing too much. So in that sense also, it's a conversation we're also, I think, internally having, and we'd like to build more on. So we're also keen to speak to more grant makers and understand different challenges that they face. Rohit, I'll allow your mic, and I think you should be able to unmute now.
Very good afternoon, everyone. It's a really great platform provided by Praxis, and the kind of presentation that has been given by each and every member of Praxis is commendable. They have done remarkably well, very illustratively. They have explained everything to us, and it's quite. They have just compared a life of a sanitation worker or the marginalized community to a journey of a river and the boat. It's a very, very interesting concept, and must thank you for them for such a wonderful presentation. I just want to say that being a son of a sanitation worker, what are the things that we need to face? Maybe the different panelists or different guests who are right now listening, I would like to give them a small glimpse, because being a sanitation worker in India is really a tough thing to deal with. Seeing your parents working as a sanitation worker, not being paid enough remuneration, not being given enough social respect, and most importantly, the kind of things that we have to do is really incomparable. So the only thing I'm telling everyone is that the kind funds can be helpful but the intent, the way the host itself herself speaks to us about the kind of intention. If you have that intention to bring something really good from that fund, then only that can be capitalized. So the funds are helpful, uh, but the intention for bringing that change is even more important, because on the ground reality, they are the bridge between the funder and the actual the beneficiaries. So from my end, that is the only thing that I want to say, and really thankful to Praxis that they have given such a beautiful platform. And thank you so much from my end. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rohit. So there are a couple of questions on chat. Maybe I'll just read them out. We have a question by Kate Nevins asking if I wonder if someone could speak a little more about measuring the impact of collective action, particularly in terms of how they can challenge the power in the systems. So Pradeep, would you like to take that?
Yeah, it is something which we did with each of the collectives we tried to engage with. This was a very important question which we tried to engage with because of the fact that the collective action is increasingly being seen as the way to make any systemic shift or power shift. So therefore, we try to find out in most of the cases from whether it is about stakeholder mapping or the chess analogy, was ideally to understand from each of the collective, that how they are able to understand the systemic shift. Like sometimes they say these rules have to be changed, but then they realize the changing of the rules does not necessarily means change of the practice. And then try to find out, okay, power to change the practice means you have to make some kind of a structural shift. You have to engage with certain issues of caste system or patriarchy or racism in those scenarios, or capitalism. So how to do that? Then it becomes so it is not about power shift which is happening vis-a-vis certain institutions or individuals or the organizations, but it is also about the wider shift of the structure where we look at it. While at the same time, how we try for them to say it is not a short duration process. So therefore, what is more important is the last slide which we showed, which is about percolation of the philosophy is very important. What they stand for, the key message which comes out of the social movement as a fragrance or as a dewdrop, it should be available at various stages. So somewhere they try to find out how they are doing it, and that becomes the crucial part of that collective.
Thanks, Pradeep. Sonal, are you still on call? Maybe you can unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, sure. I wasn't able to raise my hand. I don't know why, but I have worked with many sex worker collectives in the past, and I'm just trying to understand whether you found also a discussion about internal power dynamics that work within these collectives, and particularly about those who have kind of founded these collectives. And to what extent are they able to adapt and to change both the ideology, their philosophy, and enable other perspectives to come in? Because in the long term, some of them who are running for, having organized themselves for many years, that change has to happen. And have you seen any barriers or blockages, or how some of them have been able to shift this power dynamic and been able to adapt to the new contexts that are emerging? And I think it's not just the sex workers collective, it's the Chipko movement also, which ran into a lot of problems when the context started changing and they were not able to kind of adapt to what was happening. And so what they were trying to achieve then started getting diffused or diminishing as they went along. So any comments or ideas on how your research has indicated?
Thanks, Sonal. Yes, that's a really important point that often comes up about internal dynamics as well. But I think what's key here is also the idea which Pradeep spoke about of intersectionality and how each identity has these multiple identities that they're dealing with. So I think even in any kind of movement, there are often multiple identities at play which make it as complex as, which is the whole reason we're here today with kind of reflecting on this. So I think recognizing that, like you're saying, becomes a key aspect of even measurement, recognizing that each identity has these multiple identities that it is going to interact with at different stages of that movement, is I think the starting point for this. But I'd also ask Pradeep to add.
Yes, yeah. Especially in this setting of sex workers, setting the identity issues has always been, because each individual at any point of time might have many identities, and those overlapping of identities happens. So even there is not a monolith among the leadership, or if we had on December 8th, we organized one presentation where one of the collective members, as a mobilizer, she was presenting her problem of fellow mobilizers not having the similar ideology like her, and it is often difficult for to look at our own collective as not as a monolith in terms of appreciation of different ideologies. So some of them, so the point here is often there is a self-stigmatization kind of a thing also happens in that. So in that sense, I think the idea here is we have what you just pointed out is seen as one of the complexity which we have to showcase, which we have to reflect upon. And that's how we build this. So we have to locate at one principle, one level higher, saying that such a situation might exist and have it as a principle to measure.
Thanks, Pradeep. Gemma, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Thank you. Hi. Thank you for all the really interesting insights. One of the issues that you raised that stuck in my mind a bit that I've been thinking about is you mentioned that one of the challenges or the reasons why like traditional types of evaluation don't suit a measurement for collectives is or just one of the issues that has come up is that often measurement is externally imposed. It's an external priority, say, of a funder or another body, imposing that desire to measure and assess, progress in a sort of linear way. And so I'm interested in your insights from these experiments that you've done around what role ownership of the collectives you worked with, ownership over these sort of new types of measurement processes, these activities that you've been doing with them, what kind of ownership the collectives had or what role they played in those activities themselves. And also taking a sort of a long-term perspective, what sort of value do you see that the collectives got, or what value do they see themselves that they got from these exercises that you did with them? Is there any sort of longer term idea that these types of processes would play a role in the collectives longer term? And also sort of in terms of, conducting them independently, do you see potential for these types of activities and processes to be sort of done and run independently within collectives? Thanks.
I think this funder collectives relationship has been if we look at it from the lens of collectives, there are certain collectives who would like funders to support their philosophy. The intermediaries also support their philosophy, to stand with them for their struggle, so that they become integral part of the collective. And there are many of the funders who are at that level where they would like to be part of the collective, and so when collectives would not mind them. Again, that happens because there is a alignment of the philosophy. So both stand for each other, and you have many examples of that kind of intermediary grant making, especially from a feminist lens, who are standing with the collectives of collectivization. Whereas there are also collectives who say that don't interfere in our movement, but you can help our project, our members with some school centers or health systems, etc. In a way, they some of the collectives would like to restrict grant makers to only certain peripheral domain, which is addressing some of the symptoms of it. So there are also those collectives, and many of the funders also fall in that bracket. So in a way, there is many ways for the grant makers to contribute to a collective. And similarly, there are many ways for the collectives to reach out to the grant makers. But what is important is to have some kind of a self-reflective tools to be there to constantly reflect how this funding is trying to influence the actions or the philosophy of the collective. Therefore, some of these issues which we raised are something should become part of the collective to reflect on. It is not to say that grant makers should not intervene, neither to say that collectives should not go for it. But the idea here is there a way by which you can identify the shift or the potential shift in philosophy? Is it happening, and is it happening involuntary, or is it happening with the choice of the collectives? And if it is with the choice of collective, who is making that choice? So I thought these are the ways by which we thought of problematizing this concept itself, but at the same time coming with some solutions in terms of tools. Yeah.
Okay, so there are a couple of questions on chat. Maybe we can read them out. So there's a question by Sunita. So regarding what is the role that small organizations in this assessment, and how will the organizations be able to survive in the future? And the follow-up to her question again is that how a lot of small community organizations work with people are not getting any other support. And will they get any support, and would this be considered in this sort of an assessment?
I think that's a tough question for us to answer at this stage. Yeah, I think as of now, as part of this assessment, I think I would say a lot of the movements, and like Athena actually explained at the start, the whole idea is of a social movement approach, which we think a lot of community-based organizations, while they might be called organizations, actually use that approach in the work that they do. So a lot of them have been part of this conversation with us, especially, for instance, the 7 that Athena mentioned that we began this journey with were actually small organizations as well who use this movement approach in the work that they do. In terms of the future, I don't think I'd like to comment on that as of now. It's very tough to comment, and I really hope a lot more organizations support them. That's all I say. I think there are a few more comments in the chat, but we could also take that as emails, but I think Manish has access to thing. Sorry, I'm just reading that. Okay, he's talking about using measuring collectivization, which as it can be applied to the context of the historical labor relations. In his case, he's working in Bihar, so it's with TKDAs, and how that's central for the labor's ability or possibility to collectivize for challenging class relations. So, Pradeep, in case you want.
Yeah, this is a very interesting one, and I think this is some of the things which we are struggling with is where some of the way by which the collectivization happen is not necessarily through collective of members together. It need not be a collective of members. Sometimes it happens through, like in one of the examples which we were trying to study in Maharashtra was a collective of few theater activists who were able to change their narratives around a number of caste system, etc. So it's not a membership based collective, but they use various kinds of cultural forms to push their narratives, etc. So in this scenario also, often it is stated that it is very difficult to collectivize informal workers and unorganized labor. And it is the absence of collectivization. Does it mean that there are no collectivized actions happening? Is something which we were struggling to find out how it can reflect on it, because many of these informal, a lot of people may actually be working on this issue of informal workers, not through creating a what Tarini was saying, in an architecture way where there is a very clear structure of informal workers coming together, etc. But can there be a groups of informal workers think tanks which exist in many places, and they are able to push their agenda into the mainstream. So some of the examples, like a Get the Group workers, group of informal workers in Tamil Nadu or somewhere, where their workers come together not only to push, not only to understand what are the common problems they are facing, but also they are trying to understand how the science of that industry is moving, what is the economics of that industry. So ideally, the best way is to create according to that group's mandate, is to create thinkers among the workers, informal workers, who can ask difficult questions and also have answers of many layers of questions which can come to them. So if we are able to create a cadre of these kinds of informal workers at different locations, that can actually help percolate some of the philosophies outside it. But again, this is not a solution which I'm saying, but these are some of the things which are being done in different places.
Thank you for that. And yeah, I think Manish has replied in the chat as well. I think we can take further questions on email as well, and these, I think Athena will paste it in the chat. Yes. So thank you all for taking out the time and engaging with us in this conversation. We're really excited to see so many people interested in this conversation. I think earlier we've also pasted in the chat that we are also thinking about, and something which Marat referred to earlier, about having a community of people even just thinking about this is something we're hoping to get into and have conversations around, and really build on our idea through that conversation. So if anyone would be interested in that, we'd be happy, and we'd be in touch with you through that form. If you haven't found it yet, it's somewhere in the chat. And thank you so much for spending time with us here and understanding these perspectives and building on it with your perspectives. So that's all for today. And thank you all so much. for joining us. Thank you. Yes, our emails are in the chat in case anyone would like to take them from there. Thank you so much. Have a good evening and a good afternoon.